I want you to really focus on a highly specific physical sensation for a second. Like, imagine waking up in the dark, and
Hmm.
before your eyes even adjust, your body just registers this profound, cascading failure.
Oh man, yeah, like you're completely broken down.
Right. Your joints are stiff, your chest feels heavy, and you've got this blinding headache just, you know, digging its heels into the base of your skull. Every single biological indicator is basically screaming at you to pull the covers up, power down, and just surrender to the pain.
Which is what, most of us would do.
Exactly. But instead, you force your legs over the edge of the bed, you push through those physiological protests, you drag yourself onto a bicycle, and you actually pedal your way into the morning traffic.
And I mean, to override that kind of biological mandate requires this staggering level of conviction. There has to be a mechanism driving that person, like an absolute non-negotiable imperative that totally supersedes their own physical reality.
Yeah, and that tension, that specific tension between a failing body and an unbreakable will is exactly where our deep dive begins today. Because the person on that bicycle is a teacher, Professor Cromwell-Smith.
Right, from the Equilibrist literary universe.
Yep. And he is pedaling to work because his timeline is literally running out. He possesses this structural framework for living that simply must be archived. It has to be passed on before it's too late.
It's an urgent mission for him.
It really is. So our mission today is to conduct what's essentially a forensic analysis of the masterclass he delivers, which is in a text simply labeled Chapter 9. We're going to break down his highly mechanical protocol for dismantling resentment, auditing your own mental architecture, and, reclaiming your present.
And the contrast he presents when he finally arrives at the school is just striking. I mean, he walks into this massive, bustling auditorium, and he's moving with obvious physical frailty.
Yeah, you can really picture it.
He places his worn leather briefcase on the desk, looks out at the sea of young, vibrant faces, and before he even introduces the core narrative, he sets this chillingly pragmatic baseline. He just tells them, treat each day as if it is your last.
Which is heavy. And it frames everything that follows not as some, abstract philosophy, but as an urgent operational mandate. And before we get into his narrative, I actually want you, the listener, to perform a quick audit of your own mental boardroom.
Oh, I love the landlord audit concept. It's so vital.
Right. It's like, think about the grudges you are carrying today. Who is occupying space in your head? Maybe it's a professional slight that derailed your career trajectory, or a betrayal by a friend, or just some unresolved argument playing on a loop. You need to identify those specific toxic tenants who aren't paying rent.
Because what the professor is about to offer, it isn't just some vague emotional platitude about, forgiveness. It's an institutional, step-by-step restoration protocol to clear out that specific toxic architecture.
Exactly. Yeah. And to demonstrate how this protocol works, he doesn't just lecture from a textbook. He actually uses his own history as the primary data set.
He transports the whole auditorium back to a time when he was a young, highly stressed student at Oxford. We see him stepping off a train, his suitcase is still in his hand, and he makes a beeline for the shop of his mentor, this older woman he refers to as Mrs. V.
And Mrs. V, she's so sharp. She immediately recognizes the physiological signs of his distress, what the Equilibrist philosophy calls the biological calibration.
Yes, the physical indicators. She doesn't just ask how he is, she sees it.
She sees the clenched jaw, right? The shallow breath, the tightness in his chest. She embraces him and asks this very pointed question. She says, "Are you holding any grudges, young Oxford student?"
And of course, his defense mechanism kicks in instantly.
Oh, totally. He's like, "No, I'm not holding grudges. A couple of fellas are holding grudges against me." He's wrapped up in this bitter conflict over Oxford traditions and some situation involving a girl, and he is just entirely consumed by the perceived injustice of it all.
It's the classic externalization of blame, We all do it. And this is where Mrs. V initiates the first phase of that cognitive calibration. She points out a really harsh reality that totally subverts how we naturally process conflict.
What does she tell him?
She tells him that you have absolutely zero jurisdiction over the feelings or behaviors of other people. And to illustrate this, she introduces this concept of indelible ink.
Right, the indelible ink.
Yeah, she explains that every human being writes their daily life in a book that belongs exclusively to them, and they use ink that simply cannot be erased.
And the mechanics of that metaphor, they just completely change the landscape of resentment.
Yeah.
I mean, think about it like sitting in the passenger seat of a car that someone else is driving.
Yeah.
And you are furiously trying to reach over and grab the steering wheel, just screaming at the driver because they aren't taking the route you want. But meanwhile, your own vehicle is sitting in the driveway, completely rusting away.
That's a great way to put it.
You're expending massive amounts of energy trying to scratch out the indelible ink in someone else's book, or demanding they hand over the pen so you can edit their pages.
Which is an architectural impossibility. You just can't do it. The psychology of resentment is deeply rooted in this futile attempt to reclaim control over external variables.
Right.
Mrs. V actually describes the mental state this creates as a labyrinth. When we refuse to surrender our demand to edit someone else's book, we become trapped in these torturous, masochistic, and incredibly narrow corridors of our own minds. We get lost in a maze built entirely out of past tense events that physically no longer exist.
So if we are expending all our present-day energy navigating this labyrinth built out of yesterday's grievances, what happens to our timeline? Like, where does our future go?
Exactly the right question. And Mrs. V addresses this exact variable. She pulls this thin grain white book with gold-coated pages from her shelf, and she shares a poem with the young student titled The Past and the Future.
And this text, it fundamentally upends the standard equation of cause and effect, doesn't it?
It really does. It forces a total reevaluation of accountability because, the conventional wisdom we all operate under is that if you take a malicious action, eventually the past will track you down. We get that mechanism. We call it karma or just consequences.
But the poem reveals this secondary, unspoken mechanism that is honestly far more dangerous. It argues that while the past comes for you based on the wrong things you did, the future will inevitably catch up with you based on what you failed to do in the present.
That is the core insight right there. The future doesn't just punish you for your actions, it punishes you for your omissions.
And here's where it gets really interesting, because the text explicitly warns that failing to act in the present isn't just like procrastinating a task on your to-do list. It defines this failure as postponing life itself.
Postponing life, yeah.
But I do need to push back on this framework a little bit, because life is complex, right? Let's say someone deeply wrongs me. My instinct might be to pull back, to just stand in an empty field and assess the damage.
Sure, you need a minute.
All right, so isn't waiting sometimes just a necessary strategic pause? Because if I immediately start frantically trying to build the future just so I'm not postponing life, I might make really reckless decisions. How do we distinguish between a necessary diagnostic pause and, postponing life?
That is a critical distinction to make, and I think it comes down to the concept of ownership versus paralysis.
Okay, break that down.
So, a strategic pause is an active state. You are surveying the land, you're calculating the load-bearing walls of your next move, you're doing the architectural work. Postponing, however, is a state of surrender.
Oh, I see.
The poem outlines the mechanics of this beautifully. If you do not actively architect your future, time is still going to march forward. The future will arrive regardless of your participation, and if you didn't build it, you won't own it. It will own you.
You just become a tenant in a reality constructed by someone else. You're renting space in your own life.
Precisely. If your hands are full of the heavy, unyielding stones of past resentments, you literally lack the capacity to lay the bricks for your own future. You are a slave to the labyrinth. And as Mrs. V warns the young professor, you risk living your days consumed by phantoms.
So the young Cromwell-Smith absorbs this diagnosis, but he immediately hits the practical wall we all hit. He essentially asks, what if moving on is not enough to cure a grudge?
Because logic doesn't always fix the body.
Exactly. Logically deciding to drop a grudge rarely stops the physiological stress response. The tightness in your chest, that biological calibration we talked about, it doesn't just vanish because you read a poem about the future.
He is asking for the actual restoration protocol. He wants the mechanics. And Mrs. V provides it through a second poem titled Reach Out. This is where the philosophical theory crystallizes into a highly mechanical daily maintenance routine.
Yeah, the poem isn't some quiet meditation. It's an operational checklist.
It really is.
It commands the reader to, lend a hand, share a dream, pray for others, extend a favor, always forgive, teach those in need, wait with grace. It is this aggressive barrage of outward-facing verbs, and the young professor is understandably skeptical. He essentially asks if the entire cure boils down to just giving.
And Mrs. V confirms it. She says, to cure a poisoned spirit, giving is the absolute non-negotiable remedy. And to understand why this works, we have to look at how the human brain processes conflict.
Right, the whole ledger system.
Exactly. We are evolutionarily wired for reciprocity, a tit-for-tat ledger system. When someone harms us, our brain registers a deficit. We intuitively wait for an apology or restitution to balance that ledger. We enter a state of waiting to receive.
And waiting to receive is the exact mechanism that locks us in the labyrinth. It hands the key to our psychological state right over to the person who wronged us. We are waiting for them to write a new page in their indelible ink so we can feel better.
That is the trap of reciprocity. So by prescribing unconditional giving, extending a favor, or sharing a dream, regardless of how the other person behaves, Mrs. V is instructing him to sever that biological feedback loop entirely.
Unconditional giving is a mechanism.
Yes, it's an act of supreme autonomy. It declares that your actions are no longer contingent on someone else's ledger.
I look at this protocol like physical therapy for a severe mental injury.
Oh, it's a good comparison.
Like when you tear a muscle, scar tissue forms, right? It tightens up, it restricts your range of motion. If you hold a grudge, your psychological architecture is basically covered in scar tissue. You become rigid and defensive.
You lose your flexibility.
Exactly. So the verbs in that poem, lending a hand, teaching those in need, they are range of motion exercises. Pushing a cranked muscle to extend is going to hurt. It feels counterintuitive. But that persistent mechanical movement is the only way to break down the scar tissue and restore your baseline functionality.
And just like physical therapy, the efficacy relies entirely on independent execution. If you only perform the exercises when someone is watching or cheering you on, you miss the structural benefit. The liberation comes from the independent momentum of the act itself.
So the narrative then snaps us back from that flashback in Mrs. V's shop to the present-day auditorium. Professor Cromwell-Smith finishes his story, and this massive room is just thick with silence.
You could hear a pin drop.
Right. But when he opens the floor, the students immediately zero in on the practical friction of this operating system. They act as the proxy for the listener, testing the structural integrity of the professor's protocol against real-world obstacles.
And the first major hurdle they identify is the challenge of self-awareness regarding our own inaction. A political science student named Emma addresses the exact tension you brought up earlier.
Oh, right. About waiting versus deferring.
Yeah, she asks how to definitively know if they are deferring something out of avoidance or simply executing a strategic wait for the right time.
And the professor provides a brilliant diagnostic test for this. He explains that deferring is almost always rooted in fear or indecision. It's this passive state where you are secretly hoping external circumstances will magically resolve the friction for you. Waiting, conversely, is deliberate and active.
He tells them to examine their momentum. If you are waiting for the right time to launch a project, are you still taking micro steps to prepare? Are you refining the blueprint? If you are entirely static, standing still and hoping the universe hands you a solution, you are not waiting strategically, you are postponing life.
But even if you force yourself into motion, there's a deeper, much more vulnerable obstacle. Another student, Maya, she's a psychology major, asks a question that strikes the core of the human ego. She asks, what if the act of giving feels hollow? What if we reach out, and it simply doesn't make us feel any better?
Such a great question, because it isolates the danger of transactional expectations. Maya is identifying the reality that you can't just mimic the mechanics of giving and expect instantaneous psychological relief.
Right. If I am quietly seething at a colleague, and I force myself to bring them a cup of coffee just to check the reach out box, I'm probably going to feel like a resentful martyr doing a chore. It feels hollow because it's a performance.
And the professor's response dissects why that hollowness occurs. He explains that the act feels empty because it is still tethered to an expectation. If you hand over that coffee secretly hoping the colleague will be struck by your grace, apologize, and validate your pain, well, you're still operating inside the tit-for-tat ledger.
You're still trying to manipulate their indelible ink.
Exactly. You haven't let go of the pen.
So he tells Maya that true liberation must be completely unconditional. The cure isn't the applause or the resolution you get in return. The cure is the structural repair happening within your own mind. And he warns her that the relief is rarely instantaneous.
It goes right back to your physical therapy analogy.
Yeah, one single rotation of a damaged shoulder doesn't heal the joint. It is the persistent daily commitment to the mechanics of the movement that slowly rebuilds the architecture of the muscle.
It requires an accumulation of those genuine, unconditioned actions to eventually shift your psychological center of gravity away from the injury and back toward your own agency.
Which brings us to a final, incredibly pragmatic challenge raised by an economics student named Carlos. Carlos is wrestling with the tension between the mandate to never postpone life and the undeniable reality that complex achievements require long-term planning.
The economics perspective.
Right. How do you reconcile the urgency of the present with the meticulous preparation the future demands?
Carlos is trying to figure out how to avoid reckless momentum, and the professor provides a synthesizing principle here. Planning is a vital part of the architecture, but planning devoid of execution is a trap.
He explicitly tells Carlos that life isn't about rushing blindly into frantic action just to prove you aren't postponing things. It is about ensuring a state of constant forward momentum, regardless of the velocity. Even the slowest, most methodical step forward keeps you anchored in the present while actively laying the bricks for the future.
It is the ultimate antidote to the labyrinth. You cannot simultaneously wander the dark, circular corridors of past resentments while taking deliberate steps forward. The momentum itself breaks the chains.
It is a profound, airtight operating system for navigating human friction. But this is where our deep dive must examine the physical reality of the auditorium itself, because the conclusion of Chapter 9 completely reframes the stakes of everything we've just discussed.
We have to return to that physiological baseline established at the very beginning. So, the masterclass concludes. The students begin packing up their notes, the heavy doors of the auditorium swing open, and the crowd begins to filter out.
And the text meticulously notes a deviation in the professor's normal routine. Usually he is dynamic. He's standing, engaging, seeing his students out into the world. But today, he remains anchored behind his heavy desk. He is offering weak waves, his face is pale, and his body is visibly fighting to maintain posture.
The students register his frailty, but he holds the facade. He endures the physical toll until the absolute final student crosses the threshold and the heavy wooden doors click shut.
And in that sudden, profound silence of the empty hall, the biological mandate finally overrules him. He doesn't just sit back. He completely lets go. He slumps forward, and the text leaves us with the visceral, echoing thump of his head hitting the desk. It is the final acoustic signature of the chapter.
It's a devastating moment, and that sound forces us to reevaluate his opening directive. When he told that room of young people to treat each day as if it is your last, he wasn't offering a theoretical philosophical prompt. He was delivering a literal urgent truth about his own timeline.
He knew his biological clock had expired. He woke up that morning with a failing body. But he recognized that if he stayed in bed, if he deferred this final lecture, he would be postponing his life. He would be letting the future catch up to him for what he failed to do.
So he chose to execute the ultimate unconditional act of giving. He expended the absolute last reserves of his physical energy to hand his students this architectural blueprint, fully aware he would not be around to see them build with it. He modeled the exact forensic mechanics of his own protocol.
He retained total ownership of his final day, which ultimately leaves us with a critical diagnostic question for you, the listener. I want you to take a hard look at the indelible ink you are deploying right now.
The daily maintenance.
Are you utilizing your present energy to architect an original story, laying down the bricks for a future you will possess outright? Or are you squandering your ink, obsessively tracing over the toxic, unyielding lines of a grudge someone else wrote in your book years ago?
The architecture of your mental boardroom is entirely up to you. The audit starts today.
And as a professor warned us, the future is already coming down the corridor. Make sure you own it when it arrives.